Welcome to our first session in critical reasoning. We will talk about how to score well in critical reasoning, and it is very, very simple. You only have to know two things. First is have knowledge of the basic components of critical reasoning. Know the different types of questions that can be put out in the form of critical reasoning, and remember all the tricks that we teach you. And if you have all these three right, then you will score well in critical reasoning. So let's begin with the types of, let's begin with the components of the question in critical reasoning exercise. So the first thing that you will encounter in any critical reasoning question is the argument. Argument is the central part of any critical reasoning question. It is an ordered line of reasoning which is formed from premises, assumptions, and conclusion. Okay. Then further, we have kept assumptions separately because not necessarily an author will make an assumption to put out an argument. He might choose, he might not choose, he might have all these arguments directly flowing from the premise. But mostly he will have a conclusion and a premise. Conclusion also sometimes he may not, but rarely. Only there is one kind of question if the author wants to put, or if the paper wants to put that kind of a question, will they tend to miss on the conclusion. Okay, now if we talk about conclusion, it is the end point of a line of reasoning. Once the author has made all the arguments, he has put in all the supporting facts, he has put in made some assumptions, and then lastly when he says that okay, this is my final stance, that is the conclusion. How to identify a conclusion? Well, conclusion is normally suggested by words like judgment reached, right? So the judgment reached, or he will say things like, in my opinion, it is suggested, or the stance taken by so and so is this, a stance taken by me is this, or it implies, right? Or it can say, in the major view, or in my view, my position is, he can state his position, right? So this is all conclusion. Now premise is whatever supports the conclusion. So premise contains a piece of information that provides evidence to support the conclusion, right? And premises has those facts which cannot be disputed as a part of the question. So even if they are very easily disputed, so for example, the passage says that people in the 6th century believed that the sun went around the earth, and the conclusion is that earth was given the prime central importance in the 6th century literature, or in the 6th century communication, right? So if the author is saying that and concluding on the basis of the fact that people in that century believed something which is factually incorrect, but though it is put in the premise for that purpose of that question, you will believe that the fact is unchallengeable, right? So that is the second thing about the premise. Now, how do you figure out what is a premise? Well, words like assertion, evidence, supposition, observation, explanation, or proof, right? All these words suggest premise. Now we come to assumption. Assumption is something that is not stated in the passage, but you know that author has used it to connect conclusion with the support to the conclusion, which is premise. So, for example, Reena is a good girl. Her mother loved her a lot, and this is why Reena got 2 chocolates. Now author is assuming that because she's a good girl and her mother loves her a lot, she got a chocolate, which means that the author is saying that if you're a good girl and your mother loves you, you deserve a chocolate. Though it is not stated as a premise, or there is nothing like it says every good girl gets a chocolate and Reena is a good girl, which is why she got a chocolate, right? So that assumption that every good girl who's loved by the mother gets a chocolate is an assumption which connects the conclusion and the premise, though it is not stated in the passage as such. Coming to question roots, you need to know question roots because they'll tell you what to do with the passage. So question roots will be something like identify an assumption, strengthen the argument, weaken the argument, draw an inference. So question roots basically tell you what you are looking for in the passage. Now if you remember all the components of the question, let's try identify some of the components. So we have an argument which says a recent research shows that the CEOs of the US based organization want to add diversity. So that's the first important point, right? Second, add diversity to their organization's employee base as it translates into increased competitiveness. So these are the two things that author is saying as a part of the premise. That first, they want to increase diversity, add diversity, and it adds increased competitiveness. So this is a fact. Now you can't say that no, it doesn't add competitiveness. That is mentioned in the premise, so you have to go with it. Now it says, so all CEOs will increase employment opportunities. So it's saying that the action or the conclusive action from this is that they will increase the opportunities from the members of minority groups. Okay. Now let's begin by identifying what is the conclusion. So conclusion is, or the author believes that CEOs will increase employment opportunities for members of minority group. That's what the author is concluding. How do you know that? It says so. So itself is a keyword for conclusion. And it's saying that based on this premise, obviously this will happen. So this is what the author is inferring or concluding. Premise is, a recent research shows that CEOs of US based organizations want to add diversity to their employee base, which is also a fact, right? It's being stated as a fact to support what? The conclusion, because the conclusion is derived from the fact that a recent study is influencing their actions. So this whole is the premise. Now what is the assumption? Assumption is that CEOs of the US based organization represent all CEOs, right? Because here it is only saying that the research is based on US based organizations. Now, based on this, it is being concluded that all CEOs will do this action. But no, it might be that only US based CEOs do that action. It might be that a small percentage of them do it, otherwise others are not able to do it or not want to implement whatever the research shows. So that is the first assumption. Second is that adding minority groups definitely leads to increasing diversity, because end goal is that they want to increase competitiveness. So that's the second one, that they will add members of minority group. And the third is that CEOs will be able to do whatever they want to do, because it says that CEOs will increase the employment opportunities. They might not be able to do that. They might have to overcome certain challenges with the board. So that is the third assumption. Okay, so this is how you identify conclusion, premise, and assumption. Let's do one more example of this. The argument says Jeannie studied for GMAT for 4 months and she scored a perfect 800 on it. So Annette should also study for 4 months if she is targeting at a perfect 800. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is Annette should also study for 4 months, right? That is what the author is concluding. The premise is that Annette is targeting at a perfect 800, that is given, and Jeannie studied for 4 months, that's another fact, and that she scored 800 on it, which is another fact. Now what is the author assuming? The author is saying that my conclusion is that Annette should study for 4 months based on the premise that Jeannie is studied for 4 months, scored 800, and this one wants to get a 800, basis which it is saying that it should study for 4 months. What are the assumptions? Annette and Jeannie must have a similar IQ, because if because if there is a mismatch, then IInit might do it in lesser time or more time, right? So they must be intellectually very similar. The amount of time decides the score. What if the time was not related to the score at all, right? It's not a function of score, but sorry, the function of time. But the author is also assuming that must be a function of time. Then it is also assuming that 4 months is enough to get 800, right? This one is basically a conclusion from these two, but if it's assuming these two, then it's also assuming this one, right? So this is how you identify conclusion, premise, and assumptions. Okay. Now coming to the last bit, which is how many types of critical reasoning questions are there. Well, if you look at it, there are many types of critical reasoning questions, but we have just picked some prominent ones. The ones that come mostly in the exam, so this would be major chunk. Around 80% of the questions are like this. The remaining 20 are this kind, right? Strengthening the argument, well, it will also say support the argument, or it will say enhance the argument. So all of this is strengthening the argument. This will also be known as find a flaw in the argument. So it will also mean that you weaken the argument. Then it can ask you identify the inference, identify the assumption, identify the conclusion. In all of these questions, obviously there will be 4 options like all other questions, but what you will have to do is, out of those 4 options, see which one can be a perfect inference or an assumption. Conclusion is slightly similar to this. The only difference is inference will be a furthering of premise, so it will not be directly from the premise. You can go a little ahead. We'll do these kinds of questions. Conclusion we have already done. Conclusion draws directly from the premise, so no extra information. Yes. So I hope you have understood all of this. We will go further, practice some of these types of questions. But before that, I will give you a very good strategy in the next video, which helps you handle any sort of a critical reasoning question. Well, now after this video itself, we will practice some of the questions which will help you figure out what's a conclusion, what's the premise, what's the argument. We will do some more practice on this. Thank you so much.